While there is certainly potential within the group of relief pitchers that are destined to staff the Cardinals bullpen in 2025, it's kind of a mess right now. There are a lot of unknowns, I think, going into spring training. Obviously, between now and mid-February, the Cardinals could make some additions, adding to the group of players that are either competing for spots in that bullpen or signing somebody with a little bit of a salary that you know is going to be part of that group. But for now, it really does feel like a lot of these spots are up in the air or simply going to be rotated throughout 2025. The Cardinals have a number of guys who aren't necessarily bona fides for the major leagues. They've got options remaining, and that is something that I anticipate the Cardinals will use just to try to get through the season. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I think the bullpen looks like today and where there might be room to add. Of course, knowing that it's probably not coming until the Cardinals make a move to clear up some salary. They are in a position payroll-wise where they want to decrease it further. At winter warm-up, the DeWitts said we don't necessarily have to decrease it further in order to go into the season, but I think if you're talking about making outside acquisitions, based on where the Cardinals are from a payroll perspective, and again, we don't have to agree with it. We don't have to like it. But when I talk about these things, I try to sit in reality. And I think the reality right now is that the Cardinals ownership believes that they need to tighten the purse strings for 2025. They've done that in a variety of ways, basically not bringing back the impending free agents. Guys like Goldschmidt, we know Lance Lynn, Kyle Gibson, Keenan Middleton, Andrew Kittredge. And Kittredge's got a nice deal with the Orioles. Those guys are off the books now, and that would be the way that they've decreased the payroll so far. If they feel the need to do it further, which I think they do based on the Arenado saga as it is played out, then that's going to be still their focus. It's been a completely lame offseason. We don't have to sugarcoat it. They've done nothing. They've done literally nothing toward adding to this major league roster. And the one thing that they were trying to do was to subtract from the roster in trading Arenado, and they haven't been able to do that either. We're still waiting on Alex Bregman. That's kind of the update on that front. I think if they trade Arenado before spring training or during spring training, it will come after Alex Bregman has landed somewhere, because that feels like still the cog in the machine of Arenado's trade market. Bregman has the agency to pick where he wants to go, but teams also have the ability to decide what they want to pay him. And when it comes to Arenado, he's got a contract on the books. The Cardinals are basically asking teams to take on as much of it as possible. We know the deal with Houston that was vetoed would have been a little more than $50 million in salary relief for the Cardinals over the next 3 years. I think anything that happens, the Cardinals are going to hope to get close to that. They'll probably realize they might not get quite as good of a deal as it was with Houston because their desperation has increased and the timeline has advanced. So it might be lesser that the Cardinals are able to get another team to eat. But with Bregman, they can decide the terms. So that's, and whether he's a better player or a better hitter, better defender, all of these aspects we have discussed at various points throughout the offseason. We're still waiting on him to sign. It's been very strange, by the way, to me that he has not signed, in that the reports coming out of his meetings with teams are like, yeah, we're not on the same page with how he sees himself, what he wants. The meeting didn't go great. Like weird stuff that you don't normally hear. I'm not here to disparage his character because I have no idea where that's coming from or why that has been sort of the prevailing sentiment. But it's just an interesting footnote. He's going to sign eventually somewhere, maybe back with Houston. I think that would be the best case scenario for the Cardinals, by the way, because Boston does still seem to be plausible. And I'm still not closing the door. I know what's been reported. I wouldn't close the door on the Dodgers either. Just my feeling, because it just kind of feels like one of those deals where the Dodgers can go through their entire offseason and he can be like a cherry on top, where they're like, hey, Max Muncy's going to play third, but we'll take you. I don't know if that's realistic. Maybe Max Muncy is who has to say, no, let's get Arenado because we can put this thing over the top. It doesn't feel necessary. I think the Dodgers are going to put things over the top regardless of going after Arenado. I just think it's interesting because they've done all of these moves. They've added to their bullpen. We know about the pitching that Los Angeles has locked up, and They're signing guys to extensions. I think they brought Teoscar Hernandez back. Like, they've got everybody. So they don't really need Arenado. But if it's one of those deals where it's easy at the end and they're like, well, we're all in, why not? Wouldn't shock me. But Boston still feels like the best case scenario. And maybe there are some other wild cards like Detroit. Maybe a Toronto jumps in. Maybe doubt he would want to go to Canada, right? Couldn't even get in the last time. But I feel like it's dependent upon how big his list has grown to is part of it. But in terms of trying to get somewhere that he really wants to be, seems like Boston's been reported. And if they don't get Bregman, that would be the best case scenario. So let's say they do trade him. What happens next? I feel like bullpen is probably the top area of maybe add a guy. Like maybe make a move here to be able to bolster this thing up. The bench is somewhat interesting. I think I'll save the bench conversation for another episode of the podcast, pre-spring training, as we kind of talk about roster and talk about different things. Let me know, too, if you have a suggestion for the show, for B-Schaeff Daily, what we should be talking about right now. This has been the hardest offseason since I started covering the Cardinals to do content, especially if you're trying to do regular content or podcasts like I aim to do. They've given us nothing to work with. So let me know if you've got something that you're curious about. And sometimes I had somebody ask me today, hey, do you think you could talk about, and maybe I'm wrong. Let me know if this is an idea that should not be vetoed. Talk about, potential future managers of the Cardinals and who, talk about different guys like Schumacher and Pujols and whoever that would be interesting. And I hesitated. I said, I just don't know if people want to hear about that right now because it's kind of in the hypothetical land. And I try to do, if I do a hypothetical show, I make it clear it's just a hypothetical. But I also think that, I've been pretty clear about thinking Oli Marmol is actually the right guy for the job. But let me know if you're like, yes, I'm desperate to know who you think future managerial candidates would be. Let me know. And I can't, I'm not always right. So if I read the room wrong on that and people really are desperate for that kind of content, then let me know. But otherwise, we're just trying to get our way through. So when it comes to the bench stuff, maybe I'll save that. Bullpen, though, I think is interesting. You'll have 8 relievers to staff your bullpen throughout the season because you have 13 position players, 13 pitchers on the roster, 5 starters, 8 relievers. The way I look at it now, locked in is Helsley as your closer. That's locked in. All right. I think that's pretty non-controversial. I also think the setup roles, at least as we go into the season, are pretty non-controversial. Last year, it was pretty clear the Cardinals had a lefty lane and a righty lane for that 8th inning to lead as the bridge into Ryan Helsley. And the guys that performed in that role, by and large, did pretty well. The lefty was Jojo Romero, the righty, Andrew Kittredge. No Kittredge anymore. I think it pretty much de facto becomes Ryan Fernandez that slides into that role as the right-handed setup man, 8th inning guy. I think there will be scenarios where it's Fernandez. I think there will be scenarios where it's JoJo. There will be scenarios where those guys are 7, 8, and 9, depending on who's available, who's coming up in the opposing batting order, and the way they want to line that up. I think that 7th and 8th role is interchangeable. Helsley is your 9th inning guy. That's not going to change. Beyond that, a lot of it feels like it's up in the air. Personally, what I would like to see is your number 1 lefty non-setup category, Matthew Liberatore. I think that he looked really good as a reliever. I think this would be the year that you elevate him in status in terms of, like, give him more of that late inning action. See what he's made of. Again, if this is a Cardinals season where you're not dead set desperate to win, it's not that they're not trying to win, but it's not the only thing anymore. Player development is going to matter even at the major league level. Can Matthew Liberatore be a closer in this league someday? Can he be an Andrew Miller type? As a guy who is a former starter, he could go multiple innings. He could be a little bit flexible for you, but he can be someone that you use in the most prominent parts of a game. I think that's the best case scenario for Libby this year. I guess there's a world in which he could be a starter. I think at winter warmup, they said, yeah, he's going to stretch out and be ready to go into spring to give him bulk innings, and that could lead to a starter opportunity. I personally do not see it for this year, unless you're talking about trading away from the Michaelis Matz contingent, because as we look at the rotation, it's Gray, number 1. You can talk about, who's reliable. I'll say Fedde, number 2. I'll go, in terms of my personal belief in these players. Fedde, number 2. I'll go Palante, 3. Michaelis, 4. Matt's 5. I don't think that's going to be the way they line it up. Like, Michaelis will get the home opener, or he'll get, whatever it is. I actually think they do open at home this year in March, which is a rarity. But so Gray will probably get that. But Michaelis probably pitches sooner than 4th in that order. But just in terms of giving you my honest opinion on how I feel about the guys going in, Gray, Fedde, Pallante, Michaelis, Matz, that's kind of where I sit. And then there's McGreevy hanging out, right? Michael McGreevy. I think he should get an opportunity this year. I haven't spent a full podcast talking about this, and I think I need to, because I still see a lot of people talking about, the last episode that we did was basically, do the Cardinals need to pick a lane in terms of their retool, and they're really not committing to younger players in the way that it looks. The short version, the too long didn't read version of why I think that's okay on the pitching side, because I already talked about it on the position player side at length in that episode. Scroll back on your B-Schaeff Daily podcast feed or on YouTube to find it. I've covered the Cardinals since 2016. I've been going to spring training since 2018, 19. Every single year that I have been involved covering this team, they lose a starter to injury in spring. It's not just like almost every year. It is every single year. I could go back. I've done it at points. I've gone all the way back to this year it was Carlos Martinez. This year it was Michaelis. It's every year. You're going to lose somebody, even if it's just brief. Last year it was Sonny Gray. Sonny Gray, came in, obviously was able to return in mid-April, so it wasn't that long that he was down, but it happens. Someone's going to have something, and they'll start on the IL. I don't know who it's going to be. You hope it's not Gray or Pallante or Fedde. You don't hope that it's Michaelis. You don't hope that it's Matz, but Matz is probably leader in the clubhouse. I hate to say that. It's not fair to him, but, that's just going on historic data. He's been banged up a lot. So somebody's going to get hurt. It's just inevitable that that's going to happen. And when that happens, as long as Michael McGreevy has a passable spring, he's your number 5 starter. If nobody does get hurt and Michael McGreevy has a spring on par with Steven Matz, Michael McGreevy is my number 5. I don't know if that'll be what the Cardinals do, but I think there's a chance that it is. If Matz doesn't blow you away in spring and McGreevy looks the part, Matz could start in the bullpen. You're going to need bulk innings out of the bullpen, and frankly, I don't really know what that bullpen's going to look like as we're getting into it. I've said Helsley, Fernandez, JoJo, they're in. Libby, for me, would be in, but if he's part of the starter mix, let's say they do find a taker for Matz, or they lose somebody to the season-ending injury. We get to spring in February, and it's like, yep, we didn't know, but this guy's got arm discomfort, and it's donezo. All right, now I'm a little bit more open-minded to the Libby thing. I still think you've got other options, and I think that of the options that are in that starter/reliever bucket, Libby is the best case scenario as a reliever. I think he can be really, really dynamic and good. He could maybe do that as a starter, but we've been coming into seasons past saying that he has not put it together yet. So my thing is, I think the Cardinals gain more from Libby in the bullpen. Let me know if you disagree. I was an advocate of saying, he's got, when he's showing that moxie as a starter, leave him in there last year. But it did. It waned. It faded. It wasn't consistent. So I think from that standpoint, we saw the most consistent version of Libby as a reliever. And I think we're deep enough into this that, you can spare feelings. You can talk about it openly and say, look, we just got to lock this guy in wherever he is. Let's lock him in. And let's try to get the most out of his talent, because he's got talent. But I think it's McGreevy ahead of him in line as a starter. Zach Thompson feels like he's kind of behind the pace in terms of what the Cardinals are really expecting from him. And that's okay. You could come into spring with no expectations. I would say, honestly, Zach Thompson coming into this spring feels kind of like Pallante did last spring, except for even less of a mind on him locking down a bullpen spot. I think the Cardinals came into 2024 going, yeah, Pallante is going to fit as our utility knife in the bullpen. That'll be good. Thompson doesn't have even that, and I don't think they think very much of his chances as a starter. I think he's a still young-ish arm that has shown flashes in the past. That's coming off a career worst season. He has revamped everything this offseason, moved to a location in Florida, I believe, I can't remember offhand where he said his family moved to, but so he could be training outdoors. He said this was the first winter that he's been able to do that. So Thompson's putting in the work. I'm just saying, organizationally, I think it's going to take a Palante-like leap from Thompson, where Palante wasn't really on their radar. They said, yeah, sure, dude, go down, be a starter. That's fine, but you're going to be in Memphis. And then push came to shove. He kept shoving, and then he got a chance in the rotation, and now he's probably coming in your third best, maybe your second best pitcher in your rotation as you look at it on paper. So I'm still leaving the door open for Thompson to have that type of leap. But just in terms of categorizing these guys, I don't think the Cardinals are looking at Thompson either as like knocking on the door like he was last year. You know, he got that spot when Sonny went down with the hamstring in camp. So McGreevy, you know, you got Thompson around, but not really as high in the pecking order. Liberatore, you know, then there's other guys like Graceffo. I think they want to get a look at Graceffo, but if they are impressed by him in spring, but there's not a rotation spot, could he make the bullpen? Could he be somebody that shuffles the Memphis shuttle? Maybe, but he's still a guy that I think could be a future starter. So do you really want to kind of have him spend his summer in a car between Memphis and St. Louis? Like, that's a fair question. But as I look at the bullpen, I always get sidetracked. We're talking about the bullpen here. Libby, I'm going to put into one of those spots because I think if you have JoJo and Libby as your prime lefties, that's good. And it's probably good enough on the lefty front. But John King is around too, and he's getting paid a little money in ARB, so he'll be there as well. And that's where we get into the conversation of what this bullpen's probably going to look like. John King's got an option remaining. Libby has an option remaining. Leahy has an option remaining. Zach Thompson, Graceffo's got a couple. You've got a lot of guys with flexibility in this bullpen. Now, what I hope the Cardinals don't do, and they're probably going to do, somebody else that has three options is Ryan Fernandez. And the way that they talked about it still bugs me. The way that I recall Mozeliak discussing the Rule 5 draft was, well, last year we took a guy who we had to keep him on the roster all year, and that impacted our flexibility. As though Ryan Fernandez was a candidate to be Memphis shuttled, which he just wasn't. If you looked at how that bullpen performed last year, I call that trying to do a little too much. I get it. You want to take advantage of roster flexibility. At the end of the day, the guys who are pitching and performing, don't be eager to send them down because you can get a fresh arm up. But Fernandez technically is going to be in that bucket this year unless he pitches his way out of it, because that's just how the Cardinals are going to operate. I don't agree with it. But again, if he's sitting there in April or May with a 4.5 ERA instead of a 2 ERA, it's going to be a lot easier for the Cardinals to justify it, as they will churn through some dudes. The bullpen is going to look, I mean, there's going to be very few parts that are locked in. Helsley and JoJo are probably it. Even John King has options. An option. So I'll give you the opening day bullpen as I see it, but I'm trying to outline that it's going to change almost weekly throughout the season. And there will be guys that assert themselves. Two right-handers, because I've been talking a lot about the lefties. JoJo, Libby, King, I think are your three lefties. You don't need three, but at times you'll have three, I think. Righties is where it's a little bit lean because you'd like to have at least 5 good ones that you trust. Top of the list for me right now, Riley O'Brien and Chris Roycroft, I think, are the two righties that I'll slot in. And then, and just because I think there's the most upside for both of those guys. But Roycroft has options. What does Riley have? Does Riley have options? He does. So he'll be shuttled too, I'm sure. But those are the two righties that I think going in are like, and it's going to probably come down to spring performance, and it's going to be interchangeable. If Leahy doesn't make the roster, he could be up before long. He will be. If Ryan Ludus doesn't make the roster, he could be up before long. Those are a couple of the righties that I think are worth mentioning because one of them could be it. I've named 7. Of the guys that are on the roster, the 40-man, Helsley, Fernandez, JoJo, O'Brien, Roycroft, Libby, King. Those are the 7 that I feel give you a good shot. And then the 8th one can be kind of a funsy spot, kind of a free square. You could go, what does a spring for Tekoa Roby look like? If you want to go massive upside, what if Tekoa Roby is healthy and has a great spring and they shift him to relief because he's not been able to stay healthy, so they maybe offer that as a change and maybe he makes it. Totally speculative. I think that's an interesting one. Dynamic arm if he can stay healthy. I'll throw the name out there, Roddery Munoz, former Marlins starter. I think get that guy a 2-pitch mix and see what he could do as a reliever. They picked him up for nothing in the offseason. Could be interesting. Could be an interesting wild card. Bailey Horn is on the roster as well. Cardinals picked him up recently. Another guy with good minor league performance, struggled in the big league opportunities he had last year. Another one, Matt Swanson, I think comes into spring with an interesting angle on trying to make this club. I think he was the closer at Double-A for the most part last year, came over in the Paul DeYoung trade a couple of years ago. Older guy relative to some pitching prospects. When they got him, he was at high A, but was like 23 years old or something, was a little older than the level he was pitching at. So he's somebody that I think will have a chance to prove himself in spring. You got a lot of guys that are kind of in that bucket. I'll say Graceffo, too. If they decide, kind of like they did once with Jordan Hicks, and say, well, he's a starter in the minors, but man, he impressed us. We don't really have a spot for him now, but we just need him. We want to see him in the big leagues. Does that hamper his development to be a starter in the future? Maybe, so maybe they don't go that route. But those are some of the names. And then like the Steven Matz thing is relevant too, because if I'm placing McGreevy in the rotation, maybe Matz is in the bullpen as a long man. The makeup of that bullpen, 4 lefties, 4 righties, doesn't make a lot of sense. You might have John King start in Memphis if that's the case, and then Leahy's up instead, or, Swanson makes the team instead. Graceffo makes it instead. But I think that's kind of where they're at right now with the bullpen. Helsley, Fernandez, JoJo, O'Brien, Roycroft, Libby, King. One bonus spot that you can you get a fun guess. I don't know who that's going to be. You can let me know in the comments here if I am missing an obvious name. I'm looking here at the 40-man. Like Roby's on it. Munoz is on it. Those are guys that I think are interesting. Most likely it's Leahy, I would say, would have the inside track over Ludus as of today for that 8th bullpen spot. But spring is going to reveal all. Sem Robertson is technically, in there as well. Do they see him as a future reliever instead of a starter? Maybe. So those are kind of the guys that I'm looking at. But that screams, because all these guys are flexible, right? A lot of these guys that I've talked about, if they don't make the team, that's okay. They'll probably be on it sometime throughout the summer. You could have one more spot of a locked-in veteran reliever that you signed for $3, $4, $5 million to really help lock that group down. Find yourself a diamond in the rough, or a guy that's not a diamond in the rough. He's just, a good, reliable pitcher that was overlooked by the market, and you're able to throw a little bit of money at him after maybe an Arenado trade happens. I think that would be where I would add. And I'll talk more about a bench situation coming up. That might be the next episode I get a chance to do, is really dig in on pre-spring training, how I feel about the bench as of today. You could, I think, have room for a right-handed bat that has some positional flexibility. Jose Fermin fills that role internally, but if you wanted to upgrade from him or offer an alternative to him, that would maybe be the direction I would look position player-wise. But otherwise, I think they're pretty well set on that side of things. And I'll explain next time what I mean by that. But from the bullpen perspective, how do you view this Cardinal bullpen? Because it was a strength of the team last year. I mean, it was one of the few strengths that you knew was going to be pretty reliable. I know there were times where the guys didn't, they gave it up and it didn't go well, but that's any bullpen. You can't expect these guys to go out there and be perfect. But as I look at it now, Helsley, Fernandez, JoJo, feel pretty good about those guys. O'Brien, Roycroft, upside, pure upside for both of them. Libby, I actually think can have a really good season. John King has been pretty reliable, pretty steady. Don't really, trust him for late innings necessarily, but you got to have those middle inning type of relievers, lefties and righties. And then I think there's enough talent here that one of those, Roby, Munoz, Horn, Swanson, Graceffo, whoever, Swanson, Ludus, Leahy, one of those guys can grab hold of that last spot. I think the Cardinals would be in better shape. And again, they're not tanking. They're not rebuilding. They're resetting. So they're still trying to win. I think it would behoove the team to sign this year's Keenan Middleton. Then doesn't have to be the same dollar amount, but sign a guy like that, even if it comes in spring, to where you give the bullpen a different look. Maybe a guy with some late inning experience at the big league level to kind of tie this thing together. Because if you're still trying to be semi-competitive or at least convince the fans that you can be competitive, I think you need one more reliever. Now, granted, you might need 4 more. What if Ryan and Roycroft don't get it done? What if they get hurt? The depth thins out quickly because you're not even really feeling confident about the top 8. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a different context this year compared to when last year or in previous seasons we talked about the bullpen and how confident we are in the bullpen. You're going to have more question marks, but that we've seen question marks turn into answers. Ryan Fernandez was a great example of that. Like, we didn't think coming in he was going to be, their third best reliever or fourth best reliever behind JoJo, Kittredge, and Helsley, but he was. And so the Cardinals are looking for a little bit of that magic. And I'm not saying it's predictable to happen, but if it did, you go, all right, bullpen's actually maybe going to be a strength again. Or bottom could fall out. There's so much variance with this bullpen, just like the rest of the team. Tons of variance into the directions it could go. But that's my current thoughts on the Cardinal bullpen. We're on the last couple of days of January before we turn the calendar to February, and excited to do that. Let me know, folks, if you would like to be partnered up with B-Schaeff Daily during spring training or with our YouTube channel for all the content we're going to be putting out. Still looking for some folks to jump on board so we can facilitate this spring trip because I'm trying to get down there to Jupiter. So if you got a business or whatever your endeavor, let me know. You can always email me, bschaefer12@outlook.com, or find me on Twitter at bschaefer12. You can DM me. DMs are open. That'll do it for this edition of the show. Appreciate you guys, as always, for listening, and we will talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.